The official interest rate went up again today for the 8th time in 8 months. The Reserve Bank lifted it by 25 basis points. It said there would be more rises next year. And then Treasurer Jim Chalmers came along, to do what he does so well, which is commentate rather than fix.
This is the Christmas present that no Australian homeowner wanted. But the reality is we've now had 8 consecutive interest rate rises, which began before the election in May. And so this will have a harsh and heavy impact on monthly repayments for a lot of Australians, something like $75 a month, I think, for every $500,000 that people owe.
And the Chalmers line was, well, what could he do, beyond his control?
We are hostage to a number of developments we don't control, whether it's the war in Ukraine, China and COVID, US, UK and Europe, whether it's the impact of these rate rises determined independently by the Reserve Bank, and whether it's harsh weather events and natural disasters. There's a lot that we can't control.
Joining me is Ross Greenwood, Sky News Business Editor and host of Money Today, and Sky weekdays at 4:30. Ross Greenwood, thank you for joining me. Interest rates, look, they were far too low for too long. It was like money was free. They had to go up, I know that. But 8 times in 8 months. Are we on the right track?
Look, ultimately, yes, because the Reserve Bank has got no choice but to raise rates to head off inflation. Inflation long-term is actually worse than even an economic downturn. That's what the US Federal Reserve, that's what the Bank of England, the Bank of New Zealand have said. And even though there's going to be political heat that will come from that, the reality is that long-term inflation is related to unemployment. And given the fact that you want as many people in jobs as you possibly can have, which is a bizarre thing to say when you've got unemployment at 50-year lows in Australia right now. The reality is you want as many of those people to stay in jobs as you possibly can, because that's the way in which they and their families manage, and that's the way in which business and the economy continues to prosper in Australia.
And is this really caused in large part by things beyond government control? We're talking about inflation, and you had Jim Chalmers earlier today, the Treasurer, saying mostly beyond our control. Is that correct?
No, it's not. It's absolutely within the government's control. In fact, if you want to head off inflation, you need a dual-pronged approach. It is true, certainly, that external factors such as rising energy prices do have an impact. But let's be honest, the energy crisis in Australia is largely self-made by government over a long period of time. Then on top of that, you've got a situation whereby wages are now also potentially going to start to rise. Jim Chalmers today indicated that wages right now are not part of the inflation story, and he's right about that. The problem is not now, it's in the future, because with the new industrial relations bill that's been passed, the Reserve Bank Governor himself has issued a warning to the government that you don't want wages to start to rise and get out of control, because that will again fuel inflation and will lead to the Reserve Bank ultimately with the inevitable conclusion it will need to continue to raise rates. And so even though people think that they've been whacked with 8 rate rises since May this year, the fact is that our major banks consider that there are at least another 3 rate rises to come going out until next year, which will mean that a person with a typical mortgage in Australia is going to be close on $20,000 a year after tax worse off than what they were 12 months earlier. Where does that $20,000 come from? Well, really, you've got to hope it's not necessarily going to come if employers start to lay workers off because costs get too high and their profits start to diminish significantly.
$20,000 a year, that is one fair whack. Ross, we have an Albanese government promise that it can get rid of coal-fired electricity and everything's going to work out fine. It's going to go to renewables, 82-83% renewables by 2030. At the same time, though, we're learning that past big Labor promises have not worked out at all as promised. I think this is going to be another one of them. Last week, the NBN, for instance, announced a virtual write-off of $31 billion. That's money it said it couldn't collect. $31 billion down the drain. But when the Rudd government announced 13 years ago it would build this NBN, would build internet connections to every home in the country for just, $43 billion, Labor's then Treasurer Wayne Swan claimed, we are putting the NBN together on commercial terms and it should give a return over time to the Australian people. That turns out to be another hopelessly broken promise, doesn't it?
Well, absolutely. Of course it is. And it always was a hopelessly broken promise. And the reality was that, yes, the NBN has brought enormous improvements to productivity and lifestyle in Australia. There is no doubt about that. And maybe the payback has been in the way in which Australia's economy has been improved. But if you look at it singularly on what the government had said, that it could get a commercial rate of return, this is the reason why Australians right now pay among the highest broadband wholesale prices in the world. And that is not good for Australians. That is not good for our productivity. And the reality is also that the government effectively, even though it's trying to dust this under the carpet, should be writing off that money because the NBN is not worth anywhere near the money that's been paid to build it and to roll it out. And yet the government has committed even more billions of dollars just in the last few days to try and upgrade parts of the NBN. The sad reality is it should have been left to the commercial sector to try and find the way to commercially and expediently build the NBN, the high-speed broadband, to leave government out of it, because when government tends to pick winners, they tend to pick pretty poor winners that ultimately cost the taxpayers.
Well, you only need to look at Snowy 2.0, the Turnbull government thing, how far that's in the hole at the moment. You only have to now fear what the Victorian government's going to do by saying, we're going to create a state electricity commission, a new one, and it's going to be in charge of all the wind and solar power in Victoria. Look, I don't think that's going to work either. Ross Greenwood, thank you so much indeed for your time.